our position vis-à-vis this genocide is going to determine whether we should be in a position to sleep at night for the rest of our lives, freeing the Maksan and the genocide and apartheid now. Let me come to the topic for which I was invited to come here. There can be no more significant topic than the economic conditions for peace. A year ago, I would have started this speech with a lament about this until recently inconceivable conversion of the European Union from a peace project into a war project. But this is a fact now. Today, it makes no sense to lament what is now a fact, an incontrovertible fact. The European Union is a fully fledged war project, a project that will either land us in permanent war or in even deeper bankruptcy than what we already are in, or most probably both. Europe's military Keynesianism, which has taken over this town, I shall be arguing in the time that I have allotted to me, military Keynesianism, as adopted by the European Union, is guaranteed to make Europe less safe, more unequal, and weaker. Only two interesting questions remain. Why has Europe taken this turn? And now that Europe is on this warpath, what is our duty to our people, to Europeans, to peace? But let me start right at the very beginning. At the risk of irking Europeanists who have bought their own propaganda, let me be clear, the European Union, from its beginnings, since it was the European Communities of Coal and Steel, was an American construction, part of an American global plan that also comprised the Bretton Woods system, the Truman Doctrine, and of course NATO. Yes, most Europeans hankered for no more war and no more totalitarianism, even democracy. But, ladies and gentlemen, the European Union was designed in Washington, D.C. And it was designed specifically not as some competitive marketplace, but explicitly as a big business cartel run by a democracy-free commission, yes, the European Commission, not coincidentally located a stone's throw from NATO's headquarters. From 1950 onwards, the European Union was nurtured by and in tune with the interests of the United States, an inconvenient fact that both our self-important rulers in Europe and Donald Trump seem to be ignoring. Looking back, there's a common thread that runs through the entire history of the European Union. And what is this common thread? It is the total economic dependence of the European Union on the United States of America. Initially, the European Union was deeply dependent on being part of the dollar zone. From 1971, the European Union has another dependence, its dependence on America's budget and trade deficit. I'll explain. But to sum it up, one way or another, Europe's deep dependence on the United States was ingrained in the European Union's architecture. It will thus take much more than mere pronouncements or a few $100 billion of borrowed money spent on weaponry to establish Europe's independence from the United States. The fact that the European Union was, from the beginning, fashioned as a big business cartel is the reason why the European Union, from day one, needed fixed exchange rates. Because you see, currency fluctuations destabilize any cartel. That's why OPEC needs the dollar. It makes it hard to have currency fluctuations to maintain the necessary levels of collusion between the companies, the conglomerates, participating in the cartel. But from 1950 to 1971, the United States took care of this problem on Europe's behalf. as long as we were running a trade deficit in relation to the United States, we were allowed to be part of the dollar zone. Our currencies pegged to the American dollar. But when around 1969-97, Europe and Japan, Europe started running a trade surplus with the United States, it was game over. On the 15th of August 1971, the Donald Trump of that era, remember him? President Richard Nixon, the Donald Trump of 1971. He got rid of Europe. He jettisoned Europe from the dollar zone. He sent his Treasury Secretary to Europe to give us the message, our leaders the message, that the dollar is our currency, he said, an American currency, and looking at the Europeans, and it is your problem. Two things happened next. First, to save their big business cartel, the European leaders scrambled to create our own fixed exchange rate regime. They tried everything. First they called it the snake. Does anyone remember the snake? Then it was the European monetary system, the European exchange rate mechanism. Nothing worked. They all proved flimsy designs that speculators crushed very profitably for them. So in desperation, European leaders created the most noxious currency the human spirit could ever imagine, the euro. The second development was that as America expanded its deficits, the budget deficit of the government and the trade deficit, the Eurozone morphed into a German-led net exporting machine whose aggregate demand was subcontracted to the Americans. In effect, the two deficits of the United States, the budget deficit and the trade deficit, operated like a huge vacuum cleaner sucking into the territory of the United States two things: the net exports of Germany, France, Italy, and so on, and the profits that the German, French, Italian capitalists were making, profits that ended up in New York, invested as US government debt, US shares, and US real estate. That's how, once Europe was expelled from the dollar zone, it became utterly dependent on America's deficits. So that was what the Nixon shock did. It converted Europe's utter reliance on living within the dollar zone into an even greater dependence on American deficits. Here in Brussels, you know that better than me, they love this expression that Europe progresses from crisis to crisis. It's a delusion, it is not true. The crisis of 2008 was our greatest opportunity to render the European Union viable, to end the European Union's deep reliance, dependence on the United States. The French and German banks, and the Italians and the Greeks went bankrupt. The Eurozone's impossible rules were in tatters. The domino effect, beginning with Greece, was bankrupting sequentially our governments. It was the perfect opportunity to transform the European Union from a big business cartel, inherently reliant on the United States, into a functional, balanced, internally balanced European Union, a kind of federation. But instead, Europe's political center, both the center-right and the center-left, decided that they would change everything. They would do whatever it takes to make sure that nothing changes. And how did they do that? They did their worst. Universal austerity for the many in every country, and frantic money printing from Frankfurt for the financiers and for the big business cartel. Ladies and gentlemen, what happens when you crush the incomes of the many and you hand over trillions, minted trillions, to the very few? I'll tell you what happens. The many become too poor to buy high-value goods. Business does not invest. Why would they invest when the many can't afford? So business takes the money that the central bank prints and buys back its own shares buys art, Bitcoin, houses, asset price inflation goes up, while incomes and investment go south. The natural result is soul-crushing levels of inequality and deep popular discontent. The people got desperate. Why, they even voted somebody like me to be the finance minister of one of our countries. Then, in a state of panic, Brussels and Frankfurt overthrew governments like mine, or made Mr. Tsipras overthrow his own government on their behalf, using not the tanks, as the coup d'etat in 1967 did in Greece. No, they used the banks. But, you know, a coup d'etat is a coup d'etat, there's not much of a difference. Okay, guess what happens next? Just as in the mid-war period, xenophobia and the ultra-right rose up through the woodwork. It did again after 2010, 2015. The ultra-right proved a godsend for the shockingly unpopular radical center, whose politicians could now say to the voters, it's us, the fascists, it's us, or the fascists. But it was equally a godsend for the ultra-right, who needed the radical center to impose the austerity policies which created the discontent and the poverty, which fueled the anger that delivered votes to the ultra-right. Put differently, if Mr. Macron and Mrs. Le Pen had any sense, they should frame each other's photographs and put them on the bedside table next to their bed and say a little prayer to each other every night, because they are so much in need of one another. Liberal totalitarianism and the ultra-right xenophobic totalitarianism are accomplices. They feed off each other. Meanwhile, austerity for the many and money printing for the few depletes Europe's productive foundations. It's been doing so since 2009. It depletes our social fabric, our sense of collective purpose. That's how the European Union lost any legitimacy it had in the eyes of the public. Now, sensing this, the liberal totalitarians in power came up with one failed grand initiative after the other. Who can forget the eminently forgettable Juncker plan? Does anybody in this room remember the Juncker plan? How about the banking union? Or the Green Deal? Or more recently, Mario Draghi's great report, which has now joined everything I just mentioned in the dustbin of history. Impressive numbers were announced periodically, but they always, dependently failed to materialize. It was inevitable, as long as our rulers said no to the political union that could sustain a proper and macroeconomically significant Eurobond. The money to fund the necessary investment could never materialize. Even when they finally issued common debt during the pandemic with the recovery fund, what they ended up with was common liabilities, common debts, but no common purpose. Every grand initiative ever announced in this town was a dance with failure. It proved nothing more than smoke and mirrors by which they disguised the nakedness of the European Union. The result, after 15 years, maybe more, of net zero productive investment. Can you actually grasp this? For 15 years now, Europe has been investing zero in net terms in productive activities. After 15 years of this, Germany is, surprise, surprise, deindustrializing. And along with it, it is pulling down Eastern and Central Europe, Northern Italy, Belgium, the whole cabal. Simultaneously, political paralysis grows on the back of fiscal stress. Neo-fascism and xenophobia are on the rise. Europe's dependence on the United States at a time when the new administration is cutting us loose is increasing. And the rest of the world looks at Europe as what could have been, which now has become an irritating irrelevance. In this sad context, our great and good leaders had another woeful idea, another grand initiative. Now that the Green Deal is dead in the water, as it is, why not try, and now that the recovery fund is almost spent, why not try military Keynesianism? Ladies and gentlemen, military Keynesianism has worked in the United States. And it was worked in the United States because America has federal institutions, monetary sovereignty, fiscal power, the technostructure. It has a common procurement process that is essential to sustain a military Keynesianism. Europe has none of that. And we don't even have leaders who are interested in discussing how to acquire those things which we don't have. This is why military Keynesianism will and cannot work in Europe. Thank goodness it can't work. Thank goodness it can't work. For it, if it could work, suppose it could work, Europe would have to emulate the United States in starting a war every year, or every other year, or every 6 months, so that the stocks of munitions, missiles, could be depleted sufficiently to maintain the military Keynesian multiplier accelerator. Nevertheless, while Europe's military Keynesianism cannot and should not work, it serves a purpose, a real purpose. It is a kind of solution for, say, for instance, Volkswagen. Now, Volkswagen can't any longer sell its cars. They're not competitive enough. So it hands over whole production lines to Rheinmetall to produce Leopard tanks, which Mrs. von der Leyen makes Italy and Greece buy, even though we neither want them nor need them. Yes, military Keynesianism will fail Europe badly, but not before it further bankrupts us and throws more fuel onto the fire, burning down lives and dreams in the killing fields of the Ukraine. So let me be frank. No really existing enemy of Europe shakes in his boots, watching a stagnating, heavily indebted Europe invest billions in weaponry. They are laughing with us. Military Keynesianism will end up as Europe's new austerity for the many and a new money spinner for the very few. It will make Europe weaker while prolonging the Ukraine war in a manner that is detrimental to the stated aim of helping Ukraine. It is at this point that if there were journalists here, maybe there are some, they would bombard me with the predictable questions. Is Russia not under protest? Isn't Europe defenseless? Aren't we at risk of being invaded? Should Europe remain defenseless, especially now that Trump is removing the shield, the umbrella, the defense umbrella from Europe? My answer is clear. Weakening ourselves economically through a military Keynesianism that constitutes the new austerity, which will with mathematical precision diminish Europe further, is not going to make Europe stronger. And lest we forget, Europe already, we have 1.5 million men and women in uniform. Do you realize that? Do you realize that in the last decade, we spent 2.7 trillion euros on defense? Now NATO demands that we spend 3 times as much, which is totally insane, given how wastefully the 2.7 trillion has been spent already in a Europe which has invested nothing in terms of net productive investments over the last 10 years. In this light, I submit to you that surrendering our foreign and defense policies to NATO and sinking further in unsustainable debt just to satisfy Washington. It's the surest way of making Europe more dependent, less secure, uglier, and sadder. In this context, the powers that be here in Brussels are anxiously trying to keep their jobs and to boost their budgets by spreading the lie that NATO had to expand eastwards in order to deter Russian aggression, when it is exactly the other way around. Like the mafia, NATO has spread insecurity through its expansion in order to sell us protection. Does this mean that Putin was right to invade Ukraine? Of course it doesn't. I'll tell you what it means. It means that NATO and Putin are accomplices. They needed each other in a joint venture for a confrontation that strengthened both Putin and NATO at the expense of the Europeans, of the Ukrainians, of the people of Russia. It also means that anyone truly interested in Europe's security and prosperity first must dispel the lie that Russia is about to invade us. They are not, even if they want to. They cannot. They can't even take a few villages in the Donbass, for goodness sake. Secondly, we must work tirelessly to kill off this inane military Keynesianism. Thirdly, we must work, as Jeff Sachs said before, toward a European peace process, which uses Russia's confiscated billions not as a piggyback from which to fund more Leonardo missiles and Leopard tanks that are utterly useless, but as a bargaining chip to bring Moscow to the table to establish a European Union, Russia, comprehensive collective security treaty. And if you really want to bring Russia to its knees, this would be my message to the Commission, to NATO. Do you really want to bring Russia to its knees? You know what you should be doing? You should be working tirelessly to induct Russia into the euro. Because if you did bring Russia into the euro, in one fell swoop, you would have wrecked Russia's productive basis. You would have bankrupted the people and the state of the Russian Federation. You would have made its leaders rush to Brussels and to Frankfurt with begging bowl in hand. Now you think I'm joking, but there's too much truth in this joke. To sum up my argument so far, Europe's economic stagnation was the product of its total dependence on the American deficits, at least since 1971. This dependence yielded Europe's complicity with a decade-long American project of inciting a war in Ukraine. And now that the United States is decoupling, our rulers, resembling decapitated chickens, are running around without their heads screwed on, struggling to find ways of continuing to impede peace in Ukraine so as to use military funding to prop up Europe's faltering big business cartel. Ladies and gentlemen, as we speak here today, Europe is falling headlong into another ethical void. We mentioned it at the beginning, but I have to mention it again. The Palestinian genocide. It's not just the embarrassment, also known as Mrs. von der Leyen, posing like a cheerleader in front of the tanks of the Israeli army before it stormed Gaza to commence the genocide. No. The European Union is not merely complicit due to its subservience to the United States in what's happening in Israel and Palestine. No. The European Union is actively funding Israel. Lest we forget, it does so directly, cynically, with no compunction. BNP Paribas and Allianz underwrite the issues of Israeli government bonds that fund the Israeli meat grinder in the Palestinian occupied territories. Maersk is the prime transporter of a military machine that is now at work in Gaza. Since 2007, the European Union has channeled 2 billion euros of research funding to Israeli entities. But there's something even scarier going on. Some of our top institutions for which we're proud as Europeans, depend financially on Israel. Imagine that Europe were to do its duty today and sanction Israel. The Technical University of Munich stands to lose 195 million of funding in research projects in collaboration with Israeli entities. Ladies and gentlemen, it's important to remember the context, the historical context, and the guilt that the whole of Europe carries on its shoulders. After all, the pogroms against the Jews started here, in Europe. Europeans carried out genocides in Africa, in the Americas, in Australia. When we formed the European Union, we claimed a chance to make amends. However, our dependence on the United States and our ruling classes' penchant to profit from imperialism have made this impossible. Yet again, as a result, Europe's hands are covered in blood the blood of innocents in Gaza, in the Ukraine, in the Sudan, in Libya, in Yemen, in Syria. It has also brought totalitarianism back in our midst, here in Europe. Permit me a personal statement. When the German authorities banned me from entering Germany, including by Zoom, in April 2024, for the crime of co-organizing with German Jews a conference in Berlin on the theme of a just peace in the Middle East, they were making a point. To them, letting the rivers of Palestinian blood flow unimpeded represented their chance, that's how they saw it in their distorted mind, represented their chance of washing off their hands the guilt of the Holocaust. Over the other German genocide in Namibia, perhaps of Belgium's crimes against humanity in the Congo, there's a clear warning for us all. Economic stagnation in Europe begets warmongering, which begets a revived European settler mentality. This Europe has fallen so far into a moral crevice that it cannot easily climb out of it. Europe's liberal totalitarianism, which we in Greece experienced firsthand 10 years ago, is now everywhere and is throwing wide open the gates so that the xenophobic ultra-right form of totalitarianism can darken our doorsteps. The time to rise up is now, on behalf of the peoples of Europe. So, what must we do? Let us begin by grasping that the economic conditions for peace start by decoupling Europe from America's wars. But for that, we must end once and for all Europe's dependence on America's deficits. We, the M25, our movement, have worked for a decade on a plan for Europe. We call it the Green New Deal for Europe. And we're happy to share it with whoever wants to take it, adapt it, revise it, use it. You, the Five Star Movement, and other progressive parties, you have the organization that our movement lacks. We need to work together. We need to work together towards the task of a plan for Europe that may work, while also organizing civil and hopefully governmental disobedience to what this Europe is doing at the expense of Europeans. Ladies and gentlemen, we face a choice. A choice between a dependent on the United States, warmongering, stagnating Europe, or an independent, non-aligned, prosperous green Europe. A choice between a von der Leyen-type commission that greenlights genocide, impedes peace, illegally deletes her Pfizer chat history, lobbies for Lockheed Martin, and borrows money in country pay to buy weaponry we don't need, while condemning people and planet to impunity, or European institutions optimized against raw power and in favor of common prosperity. A choice between being at the beck and call of the boardrooms of Rheinmetall, Leonardo, and Pfizer, blind to the tax havens in which war profits and tax fraud hides, while our coast guards turn refugees into corpses. Or a Europe of rational, that is radical humanism. To even have this choice, our immediate task must be to end war, to end genocide, and to terminate, before it's too late, the new austerity going by the name of military Keynesianism. Thank you.